"You should be grateful we even let you stay this long," my daughter-in-law said, her voice light, almost amused, as if she were commenting on the weather instead of my life. And for a moment, I truly believed I had misheard her, because the room looked exactly the same as it always had. The same oak dining table, the same cream-colored walls, the same framed photos of birthdays and holidays where I had once felt like I belonged. But something in the air had shifted, something subtle and cold, that I couldn't quite name. And I remember sitting there with my hands folded neatly in my lap, nodding as if the sentence made sense, as if it fit into the version of reality I had been living in for the past few years. The version where family meant safety and familiarity and quiet understanding. Yet even as I nodded, I felt it, a small crack forming somewhere deep inside me. Because people don't say things like that unless they believe them, and people don't believe things like that unless something has been said or done or decided long before you ever hear about it. And that was the moment I realized there was a conversation happening about me that I had never been invited into, a decision being shaped in rooms I wasn't in, with voices that spoke over mine as if I had already faded into the background of my own life. And what unsettled me most was not the cruelty of the words themselves, but the calmness with which they were delivered, the ease, the certainty, as if my place in this family had already been measured and reduced to something temporary, something conditional, something disposable. And I found myself replaying the past few months in my mind, small things at first, the way my son had stopped asking my opinion about anything important, the way conversations would pause for a fraction of a second when I entered the room, the way decisions seemed to arrive fully formed without ever passing through me. And at the time I had brushed it off as distance, as adulthood, as the natural rhythm of life shifting as families grow and change. But now, sitting there with that sentence echoing in my ears, I began to see those moments differently, not as accidents but as pieces, quiet and deliberate, fitting together into something I had been too trusting to recognize. And I looked across the table at my son, waiting, just waiting for him to correct her, to laugh it off, to say something that would restore the balance I had always believed existed between us. But he didn't. He simply looked down at his plate, his silence heavier than anything she could have said. And that silence told me more than any explanation ever could, because silence, I've learned, is where the truth lives when no one is brave enough to speak it aloud. And in that moment, I understood that whatever was happening here had been unfolding for longer than I realized, carefully, quietly, without confrontation, without noise, just a slow, steady shift of ground beneath my feet, until one day I would look up and find that I no longer stood where I thought I did. And I remember excusing myself from the table with a small, polite smile, the kind I had practiced over a lifetime of keeping peace. And as I walked down the hallway, past the photos that suddenly felt like evidence from another life, I felt that crack widen just enough for a single, undeniable thought to slip through, clear and sharp and impossible to ignore, that something about my life, my place, my family, was not what I had believed it to be. And for the first time, I wasn't sure whether I had been blind or simply never meant to see it at all. I did not sleep much that night, not because of what had been said, but because of how easily it had been said, as if my presence in that house had always been something temporary, something negotiated rather than given. And as I lay there staring at the ceiling, I started to replay my life in that home from the beginning, trying to find the moment when things had changed, or maybe the moment when I had stopped paying attention. Because there had been a time when everything felt simple, when my son would call me every Sunday morning without fail, when he would ask for my advice about everything from work decisions to what kind of car he should buy. And when he first told me he was getting married, I remember feeling proud, even relieved, believing that he had found someone who would build a life with him, someone who would expand our family, not redefine it. And in those early years, I truly believed that was what was happening. We had dinners together, holidays were shared, and there was a rhythm to it all that felt steady and familiar. But looking back now, I can see how gradually that rhythm began to shift, not all at once, not in a way that would alarm anyone, just small adjustments, like furniture being moved an inch at a time until the room no longer feels the same, even though nothing appears drastically different. And I remember the first time I noticed I was no longer included in a decision. It was something minor, a renovation to the kitchen. They had already chosen the design, the colors, even the contractor, And when I offered a suggestion, my son smiled politely and said they had already handled it. And at the time I told myself that was normal, that young couples make their own choices, that my role had simply changed. But then it happened again and again, until I realized I was no longer being asked anything at all, only informed after everything was decided. And even then, sometimes not at all, and the calls became less frequent, the visits shorter, the conversations more surface level, as if there were entire parts of their lives that no longer included me. And I adjusted, or at least I told myself I did. I found ways to stay busy, to not feel the quiet quite so loudly. But there were moments that lingered, moments I could not quite explain, like the time I overheard my name mentioned in a hushed tone followed by a quick change of subject when I entered the room, or the way my daughter-in-law would answer questions directed at my son before he had a chance to speak, as if she were managing the narrative of our interactions. And I convinced myself it was nothing, that I was reading too much into things, because the alternative required me to believe that something was being kept from me, something intentional. And that was a thought I was not ready to face. But now, after that sentence at the dinner table, all of those moments returned with a different weight, each one no longer isolated or harmless, but connected, forming a pattern that was impossible to ignore. And what unsettled me most was not just the distance, but the realization that I had accepted it, that I had slowly stepped back without questioning why I was being asked to, that I had mistaken silence for peace and absence for independence. And as I sat alone the next morning with a cup of coffee that had gone cold in my hands, I understood something I had been avoiding for far too long, that the life I thought I was part of had been quietly rearranged without me, and whatever role I believed I held in this family, it was no longer the one they saw when they looked at me. The next dinner came sooner than I expected, as if nothing had happened, as if that sentence had not been spoken at all. And when my son called to invite me over again, his voice sounded steady, almost casual, which made it harder to decide whether I had imagined the tension or simply misunderstood it. And I told myself I would go, not because I felt comfortable, but because I needed to see if what I had felt was real or if it would dissolve under normal conversation. And when I arrived, everything looked exactly as it always did. The lights warm, the table set neatly, the faint smell of roasted chicken and herbs filling the air. And for a moment, I almost felt foolish for questioning anything. But then I noticed how my daughter-in-law greeted me, polite, measured, with a smile that did not quite reach her eyes, and how my son stayed just a step behind her, as if following an unspoken cue. And we sat down. Plates were passed, small talk filled the space, and if someone had been watching from the outside, they might have seen a perfectly ordinary family dinner. But I had begun to pay attention in a different way, not just to what was being said, but to what was not being said, to the pauses between sentences, to the glances exchanged when they thought I was not looking. And it did not take long before that quiet unease returned, subtle but persistent, like a low hum you cannot ignore once you notice it. And I asked a simple question about an upcoming holiday, something we had always planned together in the past, and my son hesitated just for a fraction of a second before answering that they had not decided anything yet. But his tone felt rehearsed, as if the answer had already been agreed upon, and my daughter-in-law quickly changed the subject, asking me about something unrelated, steering the conversation away with a kind of practiced ease that felt intentional rather than spontaneous. And I let it go, at least outwardly, but inside I marked it, another small piece that did not quite fit. And as the dinner continued, I noticed more of these moments, the way decisions were referenced without context, the way certain topics seemed to close the conversation instead of opening it, and most of all, the way I felt like a guest in a space that had once felt like mine, as if I were being accommodated rather than included. And there was a moment, brief but unmistakable, when my son began to say something that sounded like it might explain more, but he stopped himself mid-sentence, glanced at his wife, and then shifted to something else entirely. And that single hesitation spoke louder than anything he could have said, because it revealed that there were words he was choosing not to share, and that choice was not entirely his own. And I realized then that whatever was happening was not accidental. It was controlled, shaped carefully over time. And I found myself wondering how long this had been going on without me noticing, how many dinners had followed this same quiet pattern while I sat there believing everything was as it should be. And when the evening finally ended, and I stood by the door putting on my coat. My daughter-in-law said something again, soft, almost kind, about how it was good I could still come by like this, and the phrasing lingered with me as I stepped outside into the cool night air, because it sounded less like an invitation and more like a condition. And as I walked to my car, I felt that same crack inside me, widened just a little more, not enough to break everything apart, but enough to let in a clearer understanding that this was no longer just a feeling, it was a pattern, and patterns, once seen, are very difficult to ignore. It was not a single moment that changed everything, but rather a small detail that refused to leave my mind. Something so ordinary that I almost dismissed it entirely. Yet the more I thought about it, the less sense it made. And it happened 2 days after that dinner, when I was organizing a drawer in my bedroom. The same drawer where I kept important documents, things I rarely touched, but always knew were there. And as I moved a stack of neatly folded papers aside, I noticed that one of the envelopes had been placed slightly out of alignment, just enough to catch my attention. And I remember pausing, my hand hovering over it, because I was certain I had left everything in order the last time I checked, and I told myself it was nothing, that I must have been the one to move it. But something about that explanation felt too easy, too convenient, and when I opened the envelope, I realized that the contents were not arranged the way I remembered either. Certain pages were missing, or at least I thought they were, and I sat there for a long moment, trying to recall exactly what had been inside, questioning my own memory, wondering if I was creating a problem where none existed. But then I noticed something else, a faint crease on the corner of a document, as if it had been removed and then placed back, not carefully, not the way I would have done it. And that was when the unease I had been carrying began to take on a different shape, something more concrete, something harder to ignore, because this was not about tone or silence or interpretation. This was something physical, something that had been touched, moved, altered, and I found myself thinking back to the times my son and his wife had been in the house without me, the casual visits, the offers to help, the way I had trusted them completely, never once considering that there might be a reason to be cautious. And I closed the envelope slowly, placing it back exactly where I had found it, but now I could not unsee what I had noticed, and the question that followed was not loud or dramatic. It was quiet, almost calm, but it carried a weight that settled deep in my chest. Why would anyone go through my things without telling me? And more importantly, what were they looking for? And I tried to push the thought away, to return to the version of events that felt more comfortable, but the pattern I had begun to see would not allow it. Because this detail did not stand alone, it connected too easily with everything else, the distance, the controlled conversations, the decisions made without me. And suddenly those moments no longer felt unrelated, they felt coordinated, as if they were part of something I had not yet fully understood, and I realized then that I had reached a point where ignoring it would require more effort than acknowledging it. And that realization brought with it a strange kind of clarity, not certainty, not yet, but enough to shift the way I saw my own home, because a place that had always felt safe now held a question I could not answer. And as I sat there in the quiet, with the drawer still open and the envelope resting exactly where it had been, I understood that whatever was happening had crossed a line I could not pretend not to see. And for the first time, I allowed myself to consider the possibility that this was not misunderstanding or coincidence, but intention, something deliberate, something hidden just beneath the surface, waiting for me to notice it. And now that I had, there was no simple way to return to what I had believed before. Once I allowed myself to consider that possibility, I could not stop, because questions, once they take root, have a way of growing quietly until they touch everything. And over the next few days, I found myself moving through my own home differently, not in fear, but in awareness, noticing details I had once overlooked, paying attention to the small inconsistencies that now felt like signals instead of coincidences. And I began with the simplest step. I went back to that drawer, this time with intention, taking out every document one by one, laying them flat across the bed, not rushing, not assuming, just observing. And it did not take long before I confirmed what I had already suspected. There were gaps, subtle but undeniable. Certain papers that should have been there were missing, and others had been rearranged in a way that did not match my habits. And I remember sitting there, very still, letting that realization settle, because it meant that someone had not only accessed my personal documents, but had done so carefully enough to avoid drawing attention. And that level of care suggested purpose, not curiosity. And I asked myself again who would have both the access and the reason. And the answer came quietly, without resistance, because there were only two people who had been in and out of this house with that kind of familiarity. And even then, I did not allow myself to jump to conclusions. Instead, I continued, moving from the drawer to other places, checking folders, files, even the small safe I rarely opened. And while nothing appeared dramatically disturbed, the pattern repeated itself in small ways, just enough to confirm that what I had noticed was not isolated. And as I pieced it together, I realized that whatever they were looking for, they had been looking for it more than once. And that thought brought with it a strange calm, not comfort, but clarity, because it meant this was not a single mistake or misunderstanding. It was ongoing, deliberate, and I began to think about timing, about when they had been here, about the days I had been out, the errands I had run, the moments I had left the house believing everything would be exactly as I left it. And I could see now how easily those windows of time could have been used, how naturally I had made it possible without ever questioning it. And I did not confront them, not yet, because I understood that once something is revealed too early, it changes shape. It becomes harder to see clearly, and I needed to understand what they were doing before I let them know that I knew. And so, I made a quiet decision, one that surprised even me in its steadiness. I would continue as if nothing had changed. I would answer calls, accept invitations, sit at their table, and listen to their carefully measured conversations. But this time I would be watching, not just hearing but observing, not just reacting but remembering. And for the first time since all of this began, I felt a sense of control. Returning, not because I had answers, but because I had stopped ignoring the questions. And as I carefully placed each document back where it belonged, aligning every edge, restoring the order they had tried to disturb, I understood that whatever truth they had been trying to keep hidden was now closer to the surface than they realized, and I intended to find it, quietly, completely, and on my own terms. The moment came quietly, without warning, and in a way that almost felt accidental, which made it all the more unsettling, because I had expected something more obvious, something that would confirm my suspicions in a clear and undeniable way. But instead it was a single document, one I had not planned to revisit so soon, that changed everything. And it happened on a late afternoon when the house was still and the light coming through the window had that soft, fading quality that makes everything feel slower. And I had decided to go through the files again, not because I expected something new, but because I needed to be certain. And as I opened the folder where I kept my property records, I immediately noticed that one of the documents felt different, not in appearance, but in placement, as if it had been handled more recently than the others. And I pulled it out carefully, unfolding it with a steady hand, telling myself to remain calm, to simply read, to observe without reacting. And at first glance, everything looked familiar. My name, the address, the structure of the document itself. But then I saw it, a line that should not have been there, a revision that I had no memory of authorizing. And I felt a stillness settle over me, not shock, not panic, but something quieter, something sharper, because I understood immediately what it meant, even before I finished reading. And I continued slowly, line by line, confirming what I already knew, that ownership had been altered, not completely, not in a way that would draw immediate attention, but enough to shift control, enough to create a pathway for something else, something final. And as I reached the end of the page, I noticed the date, recent, far more recent than it should have been, and a signature that looked like mine but was not, close enough to pass at a glance, but different in ways only I would recognize. And I sat there for a long moment, holding that paper, letting the reality of it settle into place, because this was no longer about suspicion or interpretation. This was evidence, something tangible, something deliberate, and everything I had been noticing, the distance, the controlled conversations, the quiet exclusion, it all aligned now with a clarity that left no room for doubt. And I thought about how easily this could have gone unnoticed, how a document like this could exist in plain sight, relying on routine and trust to remain hidden. And I realized that if I had not paid attention to that one small detail, that one misaligned envelope, I might never have seen this at all. And what unsettled me most was not just the change itself, but the intention behind it, the planning, the assumption that I would not question it, that I would continue living my life exactly as before. While something fundamental was being taken from me piece by piece, and I carefully folded the document back along its original lines, placing it exactly where I had found it, restoring the appearance of order, because I understood now that this was not the moment to react. This was the moment to think, to prepare, and as I closed the folder and returned it to its place, I felt something shift inside me, not fear, not even anger, but a quiet resolve, because whatever they believed I did not know, whatever they assumed I would never discover, they were wrong. And for the first time since all of this began, I was no longer trying to understand what was happening. I was beginning to understand what I needed to do next. I did not confront them, not when I saw the document, not in the hours or even the days that followed, because I understood something that I had not understood before, that once you reveal what you know, you lose the advantage of seeing what they do not think you see. And so I chose silence, not the kind of silence that comes from uncertainty, but the kind that is deliberate, measured, and controlled. And I continued exactly as I had before. I answered my son's calls with the same calm tone. I accepted invitations to dinner. I asked polite questions and listened carefully to the answers. But now everything felt different, not because they had changed, but because I was no longer filling in the gaps with trust. I was observing them as they were, and it did not take long to notice how consistent their behavior remained, how easily they moved through conversations with that same careful structure, revealing just enough to appear open while avoiding anything that might expose more. And I began to see patterns not only in what they said but in how they said it, the timing of responses, the way certain topics would be redirected almost instantly, the subtle coordination between them that suggested preparation rather than spontaneity. And there was a moment during one of those dinners when my son mentioned something about future plans, something vague, something that should have included me but did not, and he caught himself halfway through, adjusting his words, softening them, as if remembering that I was there, and I watched him do it, not reacting, not interrupting, just noticing, because it confirmed what I already knew, that there were conversations happening beyond my reach, decisions being made with an outcome that did not require my presence. And yet I did not let that realization show. I nodded, I smiled, I played the role they expected me to play, because in doing so, I allowed them to continue believing that their version of events remained intact. And outside of those moments, when I was alone, I began to prepare in ways they could not see. I made copies of every document that mattered, storing them somewhere safe, somewhere separate. I reviewed records I had not looked at in years, not searching for something specific, but building a clearer understanding of what had been changed and what had not. And I paid attention to timing, to access, to opportunity, quietly mapping out how and when things could have been altered without my knowledge. And the more I observed, the more I realized that this had not been rushed. It had been gradual, intentional, designed to go unnoticed until it was too late to question. And that realization did not make me feel powerless. It did the opposite, because it meant that if something had been built over time, it could also be undone with the same patience, the same precision. And I remember one evening, sitting by the window as the light faded, holding a copy of that altered document in my hands, and thinking about how easily they must have believed this would remain hidden, how certain they must have been that I would never look closely enough to see it. And for a brief moment, I allowed myself to imagine what they would do if they knew that I already understood everything. And then I set that thought aside, because that moment would come later, not now, not before I was ready. And as I placed the document back into its envelope, aligning it carefully, restoring the illusion they depended on, I felt a quiet certainty settle within me, because I was no longer reacting to what was happening. I was preparing for what would happen next, and this time, I would not be the one left in the dark. The opportunity arrived in a way that almost felt routine, which was exactly why it worked, because they had grown comfortable, confident in the version of reality they believed I was still living in. And when my son mentioned a small family gathering the following weekend, something casual, just dinner and a few extended relatives stopping by, I agreed without hesitation, keeping my voice light, my expression unchanged, because I understood that moments like these, moments where everyone is present and expectations are low, are where truth has the least room to hide. And in the days leading up to it, I made my preparations quietly, not in a way that would draw attention, but with a level of care that matched the precision they had used against me. I organized the documents I had copied, ensuring that every detail was clear, every discrepancy visible without explanation, and I reached out to someone I trusted, not for confrontation, but for clarity, someone who could confirm what I already knew and ensure that when the time came, there would be no confusion about what had been done, and by the time the evening arrived, I was ready, not emotionally, but practically, which mattered far more. And when I walked into their home, everything appeared exactly as it always had. The same warm lighting, the same carefully arranged table, the same familiar faces moving through the space with ease. And for a moment, I allowed myself to simply observe, to take in the scene as it was presented, knowing that beneath it existed something entirely different. And as the evening unfolded, conversations flowed, laughter filled the room, and I watched how easily they maintained their roles, how naturally they moved through interactions without revealing even the smallest hint of what they had done. And it struck me then how much effort it must have taken to sustain this version of events, how many details had to be managed, how many assumptions had to remain unchallenged. And I realized that what I was about to do would not just reveal the truth. It would disrupt something they had carefully constructed over time. And when the moment came, it did not announce itself loudly. It arrived quietly, in the middle of an ordinary conversation about future plans, when my son mentioned something about long-term arrangements, something vague but telling, and I responded in the same calm tone I had used for weeks, asking a simple question, one that seemed harmless on the surface but carried weight beneath it. And when he hesitated, just slightly, I reached into my bag, not quickly, not dramatically, but with a deliberate steadiness that drew just enough attention, and I placed the document on the table between us, aligning it carefully, just as I had found it. And for a brief moment, no one spoke, not because they did not understand what they were seeing, but because they did. And in that silence, everything shifted, because the version of events they had relied on no longer held. And I did not raise my voice, I did not accuse. I simply let the document exist in that space, undeniable, complete. And as I looked at my son, I saw something I had not seen before, not just surprise, but the realization that the balance had changed, that whatever they believed I did not know was now visible. And I understood then that this was not the end of anything. It was the turning point, the moment where truth, once hidden, begins to reshape everything that follows. And for the first time since this began, I was no longer reacting, I was defining what would happen next. No one reached for the document at first, and that was what made the moment feel so final, because silence, when it follows something undeniable, is not confusion, it is recognition. And I could see it in the way my son's expression shifted, not dramatically, not in a way that would draw attention from anyone who did not already understand, but enough for me to know that he saw exactly what I had placed in front of him, and more importantly, that he knew I understood it as well. And my daughter-in-law, who had always been so composed, so precise in the way she managed every conversation, said nothing at all, her eyes fixed on the paper for just a second too long before she looked away, as if distancing herself from it might somehow lessen its weight. And around us, the room had grown quieter, not completely silent, but subdued, as conversation slowed and attention shifted, because even without context, people can sense when something changes, when the atmosphere no longer matches the surface of what is being said. And I did not rush to fill that silence. I allowed it to exist, to stretch just long enough for the reality of the situation to settle into place, because this was not a moment that required explanation. The document spoke clearly enough on its own. And when my son finally did speak, his voice was careful, measured in a way that told me he was choosing each word before allowing it to leave his mouth. He said my name softly, as if that alone might restore some sense of normalcy. But there was no version of this that returned us to where we had been, and I met his gaze without anger, without accusation, because I understood something then that I had not fully understood before, that this was not just about what they had done, it was about what they believed I would never do, which was notice, question, and respond. And in that moment, I let him see that they had been wrong, not through confrontation, but through presence, through the quiet certainty that I was no longer the person they had been planning around. And I spoke only once, my voice steady. Not raised, not emotional, simply clear, stating that I had already reviewed everything, that I had copies, that I had taken the necessary steps to ensure that nothing further could be changed without my knowledge, and I did not elaborate beyond that, because I did not need to. The implication was enough, and what followed was not an argument, not the kind of scene people expect when truth is revealed, but something far more telling, a shift in posture, in tone, in the way they looked at me, because for the first time, they were not managing the situation, they were reacting to it, and I realized then that control, once lost, does not return easily, especially when it was built on the assumption that it would never be challenged, and I gathered my things slowly, not as someone leaving in defeat, but as someone who had already decided what came next, and as I stepped toward the door, I felt none of the uncertainty that had followed me in the weeks before, no hesitation, no need for reassurance, because the truth had already done what it needed to do. It had revealed itself, and in doing so, it had changed everything, not loudly, not dramatically, but completely. And as I walked out into the night air, the same air that had once felt heavy with questions I could not answer, I noticed how different it felt now, not lighter, not easier, but clearer, because I was no longer standing inside a version of my life that had been quietly rewritten without me. I was stepping into one that I understood fully, on my own terms, and whatever came next would not be shaped by what I had been kept from, but by what I had finally chosen to see.